going to be using the Open Weather Map API, which is this free API you can get easily some weather data from. And we're going to demonstrate how to use the geolocation in the AppGyver apps, and then we're also hopefully going to do some styling and show how to make things look a bit more interesting than the default black and white thing that we have going on here. So I've actually made a little sketch earlier today just showing what we're going to make, and it shows that we're going to build a weather app, and then we're going to get some geolocation data using Composer Pro, and then it's going to, what we want to get out of the data we're getting from the API is the location, and then we're going to get the current temperature, and then we're going to get the now everywhere you see it's what you care about is the feels like temperature, which is usually the more important one. And then we're also going to have the weather represented as it is usually with an icon and a description of the weather. I learned that these are standardized into a nice table. So there's a big table of all the possible weather states that there are. So we're going to see that a bit later. Just to set up what's happening here on my screen is that this is the main view of Composer Pro. In the middle here, you see the UI canvas, which has these two default components. Here's a title element and here's a paragraph element. And this is where you'll end up when you sign up to use AppGyver and sign up for an account, and then you create a new app. Then this is the view you're basically put in. And on the left here, we have the component library. So if we want, we can put in new components, and there's quite a few different ones. And on the right, there's this dynamic section here on the right, which shows all the properties for the components. So for example, here for the title component, we get the content. And then also under this tab, we have the styles, so we can style the different components. Then we'll also be visiting the data tab and a few other things. One other thing that I wanted to show you is that if you go to the either the Android Play Market or Google, Apple App Store, you can download the preview app for AppGyver, which is this handy app that allows live previewing of the apps. So here we're talking the native app kind of running as we're making changes. So I have this on this window, so it's going to get put underneath there, but we're going to look at the preview when it makes sense to do so. So just to demonstrate this capability, if we put another paragraph here and save, and then if we grab this again, we see that the live preview has already updated. So something like you would have in lots of web editors and things here for native applications. So I hope that was enough of a description of what we're going to do. Also, I'm gonna go through all of these things in sections, and we're going to take small breaks between the sections so we can catch up with any questions. Since as usual with the no-code space, we have people with lots of different backgrounds and experiences, and we don't want to leave anyone behind, even when talking about APIs and requests and JSON and that sort of things. Okay, so first of all, I want to tell something about this UI canvas that we have set up here, and we have just this headline component and this paragraph component. We are not really going to be needing these for this app, so I'll just get rid of them both. And then for our weather app, we just want to do a little bit of setup with the styles. So we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to get rid of all the margin for the page layout container here. By the way, I did mention that here we have this component tree that shows all the components in the current page, which is a really handy way of navigating more complicated layouts. And we're also going to be seeing that used a lot for this. So now we got rid of the padding, and then we're going to go here in the advanced properties, and we're going to tick this box, which says stretch to the viewport height. And the viewport is this white rectangle here. And there's a very faint kind of this dotted line here. So the page container currently is basically, it takes the height from how many elements it has inside it. But for our use case, since we want to do this kind of full screen mobile app, in this case, we want to have the page fill out the whole container. So by ticking that, you can see that the viewport, the page container now fills the whole viewport, which is this is a really handy tip and sometimes a bit hard thing to find, but makes it easy to build this kind of single page mobile layout. And we're going to save. And then I'm going to show you some of the API that we're going to use. So to get the current weather data, we're going to be using Open Weather Map API. And I've here navigated us to the correct page already. So if you don't know what an API is, you can make, for example, let's say this URL here, the part that starts with HTTPS and so on. This connects to a server on the internet, and then basically lots of different things happen, and then as the return we get this web page that we are viewing, and this is how we build the services and things, and this is for the browser. But we can do other things with these HTTP requests, one of which is getting data in different formats, and this page is describing how to use the Open Weather Map API, aka how to get data using HTTP requests. And that's indeed how we're going to get the data into our Composer app. And this is the documentation. And there's a few ways to get data from the Open Weather Map API. First of all, we can get it by city name, and that happens by sending a request to this URL with the city name and then your API key. The API keys are free, and there's some pricing related to, like, if you have very high volumes, I think the free keys allow you to do 100,000 requests a month or something like that. But anyway, by sending this request with these information, you can get weather data for a city. And then you can also do it with state code and by some other things. And the one that we're going to be using today is we're going to get weather by geographic coordinate, which is usually a pretty common use case for a context where you might want to get weather data is sending a location and then getting the weather for that geographic location. And that happens by sending a request to this URL. I'm gonna, basically it comes down to sending the API, the latitude and the longitude, which describe the geographic location, and then again, sending the API key, which is used by the Open Weather Map API to recognize the requests and therefore authorizing you to get the data, even though it's free. And then just to unpack a little bit about what is happening with this URL. So we have the domain. Everyone knows what's a web domain is. Then we have this slash data here, which is their Open Weather Map, their way of saying that this is going to be returning data. And then this 2.5 denotes the version of the API used, which is also a common practice to put it in the URL. And then it continues with, well, what is the data that we want to get from the 2.5 API? Well, it's weather. And then after the question mark, we're going to be sending a bunch of parameters about our request. So, and this is something we could do in the browser and get some data back here. And they even provide, let's see, there's going to be examples for this. So they show an example that if you would make this request to the API with the latitude of 35 and the longitude of 139, then you get back this bunch of data. This is in the JSON data format, which is something that is pretty much universally used by all kinds of APIs these days. And this is all the data that we'll be getting from the API call. So there's quite a bit. So there's the weather, which in this example is clear, and then there's a bit longer description. And then the weather icon is represented by this kind of standardized string, which we'll learn how to use later. And then there's going to be the temperature, the feels like temperature, and then some other temperatures, pressure, humidity, so on. We could also get the wind information and all kinds of things. And then the country, and then the location, which in this example is in Japan. So this is what we'll be next doing in Composer Pro. So I'll be switching over there. And the way you start doing something like this, connecting to an API, always starts with the data tab here. So here we can see data resources in the data configurator for this current app. And here's something that's going to save me if I forget something or something goes wrong. So this is my backup data resource, which I made earlier, and I know it works, but we're going to build this from scratch. So if we click the Add Data Resource button, we get a bunch of options. We have an option to create a client-side storage resource, which is used for storing things on the user's device. So like profile information and that sort of thing that you want to store locally on each person's device. We have the one that we're going to be using, which is the REST API direct integration, since the Open Weather Map API is a REST API, and so on many others. We'll be using that. And then we have some of our own internal integrations here. But for now, let's focus on the REST API direct integration, since that is going to be used for any kind of thing, most likely where you want to connect to external data resources. So if we click this, it opens up this view for the base configuration of the data resource. So the resource ID is simply a name for us in this app to kind of call this resource something, and all it has to be is be something that's not a name of some other resource. So they have to be unique. So we're going to be calling this Open Weather Map, and then we can write a small description, which is shown in a few places. So we can, like, for example, say that returns weather data. And then if someone else works on this app, or if you work on it and you don't remember what all the data resources, maybe you have 10 data resources and you don't quite remember what all of them do, then you can add description. For the resource URL, I will consult my cheat sheet, which is here. I've made a little list of all the URLs and some of the formulas we'll be using. So here's the first thing, is the API URL, which we saw in the examples. So this is the base URL for the weather data. And so you can imagine this so that we have read the documentation and then we start implementing this thing into Composer Pro. Okay, and then these things, I'll refer just a bit back here. These things are called query parameters. So basically, whenever there is a URL and there's a question mark, all these things, like this is latitude, lat is 35. This is a query parameter that is sent with the HTTP request. And then the next one is separated by this ampersand symbol. So the lon 139 is the next query parameter. So, but of course, we don't want to pass just like static numbers. We want to get like different varying numbers based on the location and send them to the API. And finally, we want to send the API key. So what we want to do here is we want to create a query parameter for the API key. And the key here refers to the actual name of the key that's going to be what the query parameter is called. And for example, here in the label, this is again just for us for using and helping us to see what's happening. So for example, I can name this API key, because even though OpenWeatherMap calls their API key parameter app ID, I can label it API key here, and I personally find that a bit more intuitive. And then we can decide if it's a static parameter or a dynamic parameter. Well, in this case, the API key is a static parameter. So because it won't change between requests, we're always going to be sending the same API key. And I think I was supposed to put the API key in the cheat sheet, but that's why we have the backup resource. So we'll just go and pick it up from there. Hang on, there we go. So I'm just going to show you how to configure this. So we're back here. We configured the app ID key, labeled it API key, and we determined it's static because the API key won't change between requests. And generally speaking, don't do what I'm doing here. So don't share your API keys on live streams, but don't worry, I'm going to change this. Disable this one after the stream, so you won't get much joy out of using my free OpenWeatherMap account, I don't think. Okay, so
I don't think anyone is that fast to get it right now anyway.
Yeah, it's a lot of typing. Yeah, and what this will do is this will now send this query parameter with every request made from this data resource. So we have that configured there. And actually, since we're in Finland and that's Europe, so we need one more thing for us, which is described in the API documentation, which is the units. So I think by default it returns Fahrenheit, but we don't really use them here in Finland. We use the metric system, so we're going to get, for this demo, we're going to get the metric Celsius units. So we can configure that as another query parameter. So we can label this one units, because that's a pretty sensible name, and then the key's name was units, and then the value is going to be metric. So now we've configured two things that will be sent with every request from this data resource: the API key and then the units that are metric. And of course, this could be made to be a dynamic parameter. So we might in some version of the app add a toggle where you can toggle between the metric and the imperial and the standard systems. But for now, we'll keep it Celsius here. Then these below here, these are called different methods for the data resource. So for example, this one is called get collection, and then in parentheses there's get. So if you know about HTTP requests, and you might know that there's different types of requests. For example, get requests, post requests, put requests, and delete requests. And if you don't know about HTTP, then it suffices to know that these verbs, as they're called, basically can be used to describe different operations on a REST API. So typically a get operation returns either many or one entry of data, and a create record, well, usually creates records, and update and delete are similarly kind of obvious what they would do. and they map to these HTTP verbs. So create is post, and update is usually put, and delete is usually delete. And that's anyway how you would want to set up your REST API. And again, if we refer back here, it doesn't quite say that, but this is going to be a GET request. And we know that because it has these parameters, because it's very unusual for anything other than a GET request to have these kind of parameters. And usually if the API documentation doesn't specify, then they usually mean it's a GET request. If it's any different type of request, that's usually like explicitly specified in the documentation. So if this was supposed to be a post request, they would usually tell us here that, hey, make sure it's a post request, because by default, like if I type this URL here, that's going to be a GET request. And if I send something to an API, then it's probably going to be a GET request unless specified otherwise. Now, in terms of like determining if we want to use the GET collection or GET record method, we can think here that, well, the GET collection would make sense if we would, for example, get multiple locations from the API. So let's say we would get multiple cities and multiple weather data or something like that. But in this case, we're sending a request, and it's basically giving us back one set of weather data. So in this case, the GET record, the singular form, is probably going to make the most sense. And we're only going to be using the GET record method, so we can actually go here and disable the GET collection method, so it won't confuse us later. So we're only going to have, and by the way, these create record and update record, these are, since they are more specific, they are disabled by default. So even Composer assumes most things will be handled by GET requests. And in the GET record tab, now it knows about the base URL we gave as a configuration. And then as a template, we have one URL placeholder here, which is called ID, which is a common scenario that when you're sending an API request, then you request things by ID. But of course, in this case, we're going to request things by the latitude and longitude parameters, because we're going to be using the geolocation. So we can get rid of that, and we can also get rid of this URL placeholder. So, but the way this works is you have this key ID, and then in the URL you can have in these curly brackets, you can also have ID, and then whatever this value is going to be entered in the URL in place of the curly brackets ID parameter, or whatever it's called. But for now, we can get rid of this default parameter. And then again, referring to the API, we remember that what we wanted to send is we've already taken care of the API key and sending the metric mode kind of as the units parameter. But now we want to also send the latitude and longitude. And we're going to do that by adding some query parameters to the GET request. So the first one is going to be called, we're going to label it latitude, and then the name of the parameter in the API was lat. And then it's not going to be static, and it's not going to be optional, since we can't really, it doesn't make sense to send location request without this parameter. So we're going to make it mandatory for the request. So now it's a dynamic one, not static, and it's not optional. And then we're going to do the same thing for the longitude parameter. So that's going to be labeled longitude, and then the key is long. And then we do the same thing. So it's not static and it's not optional. And doing this, we can actually, we have now configured the base configuration, which gave us the URL and the API key. And now we've configured the GET record parameters. So now we'll be able to form that full request that we could make manually also in the browser, or as was described in the API documentation. So with this, we can now go into the test tab. And since we configured those mandatory parameters, they now show up here as latitude and longitude. And we can now test. Let's see, I have some numbers in mind. Let's see what we get if we send the latitude of 60.1 and the longitude of 24.9. Okay, so we get some data. There's the description is broken clouds. The temperature is 5 and some 5.9 there, and then the location name is Helsinki and the country is Finland. So now we know that we've sent this sends a live request to the API using the parameters that we configure here. And the API key is handled with the base configuration. So we're not even seeing the API key here because it's kind of like included now in every request, as is the units metric thing. So that's why this is going to be Celsius that we get back here. And having done this and seeing that the API call and the data resource works, we can now press the set schema from response button. What that does is it takes this return data, and what is a schema? Schema is the structure of this data. It's not necessarily the data itself, like specifically that the temperature is something, but it's this idea that the data has this structure where you have like a weather list, and then you have this ID, and then a key called main, and then a description and so on, or that you have this main key here under which you find temp and fields. Like that is schema, and that is something that we can store from the response. And having done that, we can now see that the Composer now has saved this schema, and this will help us a lot when constructing our app, because we'll be able to visit various things and kind of get really intelligent pre-use out of the schema. And we don't have to constantly, from this point on, we don't really have to refer to the API documentation to know which fields are available and so on. But this is all we need to do with the data resource. So that is now functional, and we can save. And now I think there's a little break for questions while I take a sip of water.
Yeah, I think so far nothing specifically with the API, but there was a question about setting custom values or updating the numbers on padding. So I don't know if you want to wait until you get into the styling elements to kind of demonstrate that really quickly, or if you want to show that.
Yeah. It's Let's. I hope I remember once we get there. It's basically like most of the things that you see in Composer, you can kind of automate and bind them to other values and things. So for example, here we kind of enter data for the latitude and longitude, and next we're going to see how we're going to make them depend on the geolocation of the device itself, and that's probably going to explain that bit also.
And let me see. I think, I think so far it's no specific questions. I've been also answering some in the chat as they come in. Somebody asked on Twitter that text cannot be edited on the canvas, only in the properties, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. In the Composer editor, yeah.
Yeah. I can.
I'll carry on from this. So what we just did was we configured this data resource to use the Open Weather Map API, and then now we are able to also pass these latitude and longitude parameters, and all of this information we got by looking at the Open Weather Map like basically this bit here explained us most of what we need to be doing here. And what we did was we just made a data resource in Composer that kind of configures and parameterizes and sets us up to be able to make lots of these requests really efficiently. So with that, the data resource is done. We can see it in the list. And then we can head back to the view canvas. Before we make a UI, we need to have some way or some place to get the data eventually. So in the test tab, I was now able to enter the manual numbers, but the end result, the desired end result here is that we can get the device location and then get the data based on that location and then put it somewhere so we can put it on our UI, which is that we're going to build eventually. So in Composer, there's this other part of the data resource system and handling data, which is found here under this toggle, where we can toggle between the view canvas and variables. And under variables, we have lots of different types. We have app variables, page parameters. If you sign up to the platform and watch some of the onboarding videos and other material, you can get a really good idea of how and when to use these. We are not going to be using these today since we're mostly working with the weather data. So we'll be heading to the data variables section. And the data variables are always created based on a data resource. So they are always connected to some data resource and the schema of the data resource. So when we click here, we get the list of the data resources that we can use to create the data variable from. And we're going to use the data resource, the open weather map that we just created. There, now it's created. Now we can name our variable. I'm using this camel case syntax that the variable names can't have spaces in them. So if I would try to save that, that wouldn't work too well. So this is one way of doing them. There's many different ways of doing variable names, but as long as you make sure that they don't have spaces and you know, and only one variable has the same name, then you're pretty much good to go. So any style is fine with me. And this data variable, which is going to interact with the data resource, and the data variable can then interact with all of our view components and our kind of visual display of things. It's going to be of the single data record type because it's getting data as a single record here, which is the kind of the hint here is showing that get record, and also all the other ones are disabled. So we'll just go for this one. And now we see again the benefit of doing these configurations and labeling things in the data configurator, because now the single data record already knows that, hey, there's like these latitude and longitude parameters that are related to this data variable. And now I'm going to show you one of the main tools in Composer, which is the logic canvas, which can be always accessed here. This is now showing the logic for this data variable. So by default, a data variable when the page is mounted, aka when the app is started and all the pages have been mounted, it gets a record from the data resource, and then it sets it into a data variable. And this is kind of a default, and then it does it again every 5 seconds just to keep it sort of updated in the view. And this default flow is useful for a lot of situations. But of course, now we see that we have this latitude, we have configured this latitude and longitude parameters. And so we need to kind of get this information from somewhere so that this logic can work. And also another thing that we might want to do is, since it's a weather app and you kind of want things to be timely, then rather than on app start when the page is mounted, we might want to do these things when the page is focused, which is to say whenever the page is refreshed or visited or anything like that. So I'm gonna dismantle for now the default logic here. There's these connections between the nodes, and you can simply delete them away. And I'll get rid of all of these things. And these are the flow functions now that remain of the flow, and these are all good. We want to keep this. However, we want to get the location, and we can do that by going here on the left in the flow function library. And the flow function library has lots of different functions for different things, like opening different page or creating alert or confirm dialog and showing spinners and getting data, and lots of different things can happen in the logic. And the logic is always constructed from these logic flows that are these connected sets of nodes. But right now we can get the GPS location node, and it just tells us that we are happy with these parameters, update the sensor variables, and yes, high accuracy is fine with us. And then we wanted to connect this from the page focused node. And then here you have two outputs. So the top output in Composer is used always when things go well and we get the data, and the bottom output is usually used when there is an error or something needs your attention. So for example, we could pin an error message here in case the GPS location, for example, can't be gotten. And then we're going to connect the GPS location to this get record node. Now, it's important to note that these connections, they don't really handle data, they just handle the execution order. So what is happening here now is when the page is focused, we're going to get a GPS location from the device, and then we're going to go into the get record node. But the way we can get the GPS location into the get record node so that we can use the data resource is we go over this X and it says not bound to any value. And that's what we want to change. We want it to be bound to some value. And when we click it, we open up the binding editor. And this allows us to bind this to many, many things. Like earlier, you saw me entering the static numbers into the latitude and longitude. So that was kind of a static binding. And we can also access all the data and variables and component properties. But right now, since we want to get the GPS location from the previous node, we're going to be using the output value of another node. And here we can see kind of nodes in this logic flow. Well, we're not going to get any data from the page focused node, so we're going to be using the GPS location. And again, like with many things, the device location is going to give us a bunch of data, but for this, we're going to be interested in the latitude and longitude. And now we have made a slight, very small error, which we can fix. Now this actually is good demonstration of certain features. So right now it's saying the latitude and longitude are incompatible. So it says the type number is not assignable to type text. And as you might have caught, let's save this for now, but let's go back into the data tab. And what happened here is that when I created these parameters, I set them to be the text type, whereas they should be the number type. So, and I wasn't actually sure, this is like one of the details that I didn't remember is which type data the API actually returns, but it is indeed number. So just by changing these value types to number, we can fix this issue. So anytime you encounter kind of incompatible values, it's probably a type mismatch. So it's important to understand that even though like a number like 1, 2, 3 can be text, but it can also be a number, and this is sometimes significant in the UI. So we changed the number, the types of the parameters here, and now we're ready to go back here, and we're going to bind the latitude, and now it's available for us because the types match. So we're binding a number, and the type of the latitude is number. And now we can see that the latitude value for the data resource is now bound to the GPS location value node here. And then we're going to do exactly the same thing for the longitude value. Yeah, this might seem a bit confusing if you're not used to this, but I kind of wanted to put this on the top of the program, since this is really where like this is how you can create interesting things with APIs and using the device sensors and so on. So I'll just once again tell you what this does. So when we are in the data variables tab, we have created data variable from the Open Weather Map resource, and the data variable has a logic canvas, which means it can have logic flows of its own. And in this case, we have specified a logic flow, which when the page is focused, aka when the page is accessed in any way or refreshed or pretty much anything, we're going to get a GPS location, and this just gets a GPS location from your device. And then after that, we have the get record node, which is using the data resource. And here's where we bound the values from the GPS location node to the get record node. So now, anytime we open the page, we're going to get a GPS location from the device, and then we're going to use those coordinates to make a request to the Open Weather Map API. And then finally, as in the kind of default workflow, we're going to be setting the result of the get record operation to this data variable. So it shows that simple mistakes can happen to everyone. But if we save, and now this is getting the data live, and if we go here, we can see that we're in Helsinki indeed. And this here on the view canvas is now bound. So I'll show this step again also. So if you start with a paragraph element, by default, it's bound to the static content. And then you can open up the binding editor, and you can find, for example, a data variable, in this case, the weather data. And now, because we saved the schema, it knows about all the parameters and so on. And we can find the name parameter. So once it actually, now the preview value is the same as the live location, but I can assure it's a, well, I can even show you. So if we write here as a preview value, for example, Stockholm, this sets the, since when editing on the UI canvas, it's not live, it's using the stored data. So these preview values are a handy way of entering these like placeholder values. So now on the UI canvas, it shows the preview value, but if we go to the app preview, it gets the live location, and it's Helsinki. So now we can start, having set up the data resource and the logic for populating the data variable, we can get into creating the rest of this app there. Again, apologies, but it's nice that we got this sorted in, and I got some good questions into, so that's good. Now to build the UI part of this, let's refer back to my sort of design document here. So what we wanted to get is the location, and then we want to get the temperature, and then the feels like number. And I can show you how to get the temperature. Of course, we can do it the same way by creating a paragraph and then binding to a data variable. And then we can find the temp value here, which is, as we can see from the preview, is correct. Now, well, and we can see it in the live preview as well. Well, it's evening here, so it has gotten colder since we made the test a few moments ago by a degree or so. So now the live value here is 4.8 Celsius. But of course, the problem here now is that this is not a way to kind of display temperatures. So if we refer to this kind of sketch here, well, I closed down the sketch, but if we think about it, what we want it to be is something like this. We want it to be something like +1 and then, Celsius and so on. And it's kind of like, and not maybe even plus, because usually when you're doing positive numbers, it's like 1. And then for minus, it's minus. So binding the temperature number here isn't really like what we want out of the UI. So what we can instead do is we can use a formula to make the text more interesting. And I'm going to use this kind of like my cheat sheet to show you how to do the formula. And there's a couple of things here. This is a bit of a template, but we can show the template better through a formula. So the formulas are entered with the formula binding type, and that puts us into the formula editor. And in the formula editor, we can do stuff like combine numbers. So it shows us the preview there. So 1 + 2 would be 3. And then we can also like glue numbers here. So and spaces and all kinds of things. So this is usually the most programming any composer app ever gets is this. And what we want to do here to make this kind of nice is create this thing where we create a number where it's we can control it with the depending on the sign and add the kind of Celsius denominator there at the end. And we can get the weather data here as well in the data variables. And then you see this kind of like, if you have done any sort of programming, you know how this kind of dots name spacing works. But all it really is it separates the levels that you see in the data here. So you have this object starting here, and then you have the weather key. Well, it's the same thing kind of here that you enter the different properties of and here if we go to the main key, for example, so the data.weather-data.main, we can see that the values under that would be temp and so on. So if we want to get to the temp, we can just click and get that, and then we can get to the same value here. This can again take some time to get used to, but it is really quite easy. And once you understand the relationship between this, so again, if I start going back here, then it shows this object. And if we go back and remove the main, then we are on the main level of the weather data and so on. So that's how we can also in formulas access all the same things. And it's not, sometimes people experience this as difficult, but it's not very difficult. And from my cheat sheet, I just took this template for this formula so that we don't have to figure it out from scratch. So I'm gonna work this in to the data variable temperature, and yeah, do here the same thing. Let's see. Okay, so here we can see, well, it's a bit light, but maybe you can see that now we are formatting sort of much more reasonable display for our temperature. And what this formula is doing is it's an if formula. So you have all kinds of different types of formulas here for math and financials and processing list and all kinds of things. most of this will actually be in some way familiar if you've ever worked with formulas in Excel or something like that. And the if formula works so that it takes a condition, and then we can return one of two things based on it. So in this case, the condition is if the data weather data.main.temp is larger than 0, then we're going to attach a plus sign, and then because the minus signs are returned already by the API. So if there was a negative temperature, then the temperature reading would say, for example, -4, since numbers, 4 is 4, but -4 is -4, and you get the sign in front. But we wouldn't get the plus for the positive numbers without doing this. So if the weather data entry is more than 0, then we're going to put plus on it, and otherwise we're not going to glue anything in front of it. And then we'll just take the number itself that the API returns, and then we're going to add this Celsius degrees symbol here. So we get a nicely formatted string. And now there's one more thing here that is not something you would see in temperature readings. I don't think we don't usually communicate temperature readings in decimals, at least not with 2 decimal places. So let's say we would want to have it only with 1 decimal place. So we would, instead of saying +5.59, we would just say +5. Because the API, of course, wants to report it in the highest possible accuracy. And we can do this with the round function. And you can always, in the formula editor, you can find the documentation for all of the functions here on the right panel. So, and also examples. And what's kind of neat is that these examples are live. I don't think this is a thing that many people know. So if we, let's make that 4.55. Okay, so we get a 4.6 there. So now if in the display we would want to round this number up, then we add the rounding formula here, and then we can give the precision, well, we'll keep one decimal point. So I think that looks a bit better, and maybe for my personal taste, I would also like to have a little air between the plus and the 5.6 Celsius degrees, but just maybe. So we can save that. And again, this preview value we can set to anything we want, but in this case, it kind of makes sense to keep it that way. So we remember what the formula is outputting. I think we're going to have to dig into the Q&A a bit to make a couple of more things here in the kind of the last 15 minutes, since we lost a bit of time with the flow function error. Are there any questions at this point?
Yes, let me see. There was one from Mike a little while ago. Can we debug values from GPS and APIs step by step in debugger mode?
Well, what you can do, you can see, I'm not going to go into the debugger right now, but you can see a lot of stuff in the debugger, and then really sort of maybe familiar to lots of, one thing that I personally like to do is when working with, for example, this kind of logic is well, I'll actually show it here. So what you can do here when you go to the formulas is you can go to the utilities, and you can encode a lot of things in JSON. So if I stick in there, for example, the data variable, then I can get the output of the data variable. So this is kind of like one of the more powerful debugging techniques. And what I would do with this is I would make a paragraph in my app or perhaps a different page and just have it like dump the live values into the view as I'm doing it. So you can like see it in the preview and kind of like have a setup on your own. And I think a combination of this encode JSON technique and using the debugger tools is and the alert nodes is going to get you really far in this. And I think people just have very different approaches to this. But yeah, that's how you would, and that's if we weren't on a live stream, then that's how I would have debugged the previous problem as well, kind of going it the honest and slow way.
There was one just now, and sorry if I'm going a bit out of order, just kind of want to focus on the ones that are happening for now, just on the things that are being shown at the moment. There was one from Wolfgang. Can you concat integers and strings in that formula? I think that was referring to the formula that you just used a minute ago.
Yes, that's exactly what we're kind of doing here. Is we're concatenating strings and numbers here, and the rules are in. Whereas in other places in Composer, the rules are pretty strict, and the things have to kind of match up. In formulas, you kind of like just need to end up to the type specified here. And here actually the specified type is text/number. So either one of the outputs is fine. So, and all of these conversions are handled. And if things don't behave the way you want, then you can also use, for example, this number flow function, which makes sure that it converts things explicitly to numbers. And there's a string function also, and a couple of other ones. And you can also check a lot of things, like exactly if your logic really cares about, or you need that sort of accuracy, then you can check this out. Now with this, I could still show you one thing that we can make this much better in Composer, and a really powerful feature that I wanted to get into today. I'm sorry for the style buffs, but I think we'll have to cut short on the styling a bit today. But doing this is fine, and we have now taken the number here. But if we think about the original thing here, we wanted to have two temperature readings, like this general temperature reading and then the feels like reading. And sure, we can just like go and copy this all and add all of these things and sort of like make all of this again. But that's not, you know, it goes for two temperature readings. But what if we want to show 10 temperature readings? Then copying and pasting the same formula doesn't really do much for us. So I'm gonna quickly show you how to create your own components for this kind of situation. So creating a component starts with the container component, and the container component, as it's called, is literally just a container. So it just sort of sits there and contains other things. And we can take this paragraph that we just created and we can put it inside the container. So now we can see that it's in the container, the paragraph, and this one is outside. And once we have a container, what we can do with it is, by going to the properties here, is we can turn it into a new view component. And then it's going to ask me, like, do I want to do this? And I'm like, yes. And now there's a bunch of these stripy things here. And that means that we are in the isolation mode. So we are no longer on the UI canvas. As you can see, the UI canvas is gone and we're only inside this container. So now we are kind of in this separate space for this container only. And a much better way to handle special formatting like this would be to have a component that kind of takes in the number and then adds all of these things and kind of the conditional logic so we can use it everywhere. So starting out with the paragraph that we had, well, we have a static number here, but that's not going to really make this into an interesting component. So what we want to have is be able to input a single number into this component, and then it have the component do all of this formatting, so we can just reuse the component rather than paste the formula everywhere. And the way to do this is go here in the properties panel, and this is another way you can tell that we are inside a component. This is no longer variables, but it's properties, and we can see some default properties that almost all components have, such as the background image and visibility. But we can create a new property, and I'll just call it temp for temperature, and then I'll give it the title temperature, and then I'll say the value is a number, and there isn't going to be any default value here. And then we're going to show it in the advanced section of the component. So by doing this, we are now able to input a number into the component. So if we go here, and now it's a component, and we go to the advanced tab, there's a temperature reading here. And if we want, we can bind it to the data variable main temp, like that, like we did with originally doing it with the paragraph component. So now we're sending into this new component that we just created using the container, just the temperature reading. And this is still displaying the static thing because that's here. But now, of course, instead of accessing this here, these temperatures, we can access the internal properties, and this actually simplifies the formula a lot. So we can do this thing where we replace the data variable reference to the temperature with the internal property reference to the temperature. So now, yeah, that seems like a fine preview value. So now when we do this, now it's going to take the internal property temperature value, which we're sending from outside the component. So if we, yeah, so what you can see here now is this component, and it's here under the advanced tab. The temperature is here and it's bound to the weather data main temp. So that comes from the data variable, but now it's bound just to this. It's just a simple binding to this component that we made. And if we look at the preview, we can see that it works just fine. But also if we copy it and save, it works just fine. And if we want to change this to, let's say, let's make another container, and we'll put in here feels like, and then we put this other instance here inside the container. Yes. Another good thing to do is eventually to rename your container. So for example, we can call this the feels like container, so we can know what is going on here in this one. And what we can do, let's just show a bit of the styling, is we can go to the container styles, and then we can enable a horizontal layout. And now if we just reorder these around, we're getting maybe a little bit of air there between the components. So let's have a little bit of margin there, maybe like, well, I think 16 will do us fine. So now we are able to create this layout very easily, and we just use the same component over there. And now all we have to do is change this instance of the component to use the feels like temperature rather than the main temperature. And again, we can access that through the data variable. So the feels like temperature is going to be usually a bit different from that. So, and if I load the preview, so in Helsinki right now, it's nominally 4.2 degrees, but it feels like +1 because it's quite a nasty wind outside and not much sunlight. So that's how we get there. Let me see. Well, just to show you how to do maybe a very simple thing is in the data, if we look into the data, maybe from here, and the schema, we can see that there's this weather icon property, and getting the weather icon happens. We can learn from the open weather map that there's going to be weather icon related to the weather response. And it's this strange little standardized sequence. For example, for rain, the icon is called 10n. And then how to get the icon URL, they simply instruct that you can get it by sending a request to this URL and then the icon name. So if we press from there, we will get the rain icon. Okay, so you might already see where this is going, but actually using this in an image component, now that we have all the data, is going to be pretty simple. So if we go back to the UI canvas and we simply add an image component, and now the source image is just this default kind of placeholder image, but the source can of course also be bound to anything we want, for example, a formula. And then we can bind it to this, and we need to add the string markers here, the quotations. But now we would get the static icon. But of course, that's not what we want. We want the specific icon for our weather. So we want to replace this 10D part here, and we can do that by kind of creating a split in the string, and then from the data variables entering the icon in there. And we can already see in the preview that it works out. And if we want to style this also just a little bit, we can make it a bit tinier by saying that it's maybe, I think these are supposed to be around maybe, okay, the image position things. Okay, there we go. And again, if we the standard icon for the current weather, I guess this is just like it's clear, but it's nighttime. I think this is supposed to represent a moon, and earlier it was cloudy, so the same stored information says it's cloudy. Yeah,
in Finland we have just a black sun.
Yes, black sun. Well, let's just see what we can make another. The layout is not as honed as I was wishing it to be, but we have all the things there. And if we just bind this paragraph again, let's make it give it custom name here. So this is going to be the weather container. And then if we just take this paragraph and bind it to the same data variable. So, but as you can see from all of this, it's basically a lot of this working is just getting the data. The flow is to get the data resources to work, and then be able to kind of hone in on the properties that you want to use in the data, and then display them in the sort of the, I think, where is the thing that I wanted? I'm sure it was there. I think we can reach it with a formula. So sometimes things can be returned. Oh yeah, it's because it's a list. So we need to access this through the formula rather. So that's why we weren't able to access this, since this information in the Open Weather Map API is actually housed in a list, even though it's always a list of like apparently one item, but still. So, but we can still reach that text there and get the broken, like the weather information there. And then we can do the same thing here with the styles. And we're using Flexbox, so we are able to simply say that rather than doing anything complicated, just like in modern CSS, we can just say what the order of the items should be. So here's the live version. So in Helsinki right now, 4.2 feels like plus 1.1, and it's clear sky, and apparently black sun is looking over us all. And with that, I'll wind down the demonstration. Again, sorry about the little time waste with the GPS location thing, but we still got to do things with live location and live weather, and with maybe a few minutes more, we could polish this. Maybe you can see we could polish this into a very nice looking app. So thank you.
Great. Nice. Maybe I will just circle back to one question that was asked quite a while ago and repeated. I think Larry wanted to know if there was a way to set default values for location coordinates.
Yeah, you can do it. Well, I'll show you how to set a default value for anything. So I create a paragraph, and then I bind it to a formula, and then I take this utility function called default. And now let's say we have something that exists, for example, the location name. Okay, so default is what is a good default? Well, there's your fine Finnish place name, Kihnia. So the way this works is the default sees if the first argument exists, and then if it does, it uses that. But if it doesn't, then it uses the placeholder. So if we use this and see the preview, we can see that the location exists. But if we go back into the formula and we break things, so it doesn't exist, and we save again, it actually even knows it doesn't exist because it knows the schema. So then we get Kihnia instead. And that's how default is a really, I feel, kind of overlooked function in formula function, in how useful it can be in your formulas. And you can like create really, really nice kind of default behaviors and clean strings by using default. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, that's great. A lot of people saying thank you, great demo. Maybe you could actually show, since somebody asked, the logic canvas, just to show which module was missing or where you made the mistake earlier.
Yeah, so sure. Let's revel in the error of my ways.
Have to go back and
okay. So here where again, the logic flow on page focus, we get a GPS location, then we get a record, then we put the values from here, we bind them. So these are bindings, the output value of another node, and here you can target other nodes in this logic flow. And here the mistake was that as I was doing this, I ended up probably because I was talking about something else, I ended up doing this. And this works because this is correct. It just doesn't do anything. So basically what this does is it sets this data to the data variable that's called this, and this does nothing, because setting the data variable to its own content does nothing. Well, it could do something, because we could have an event from the data variable change, but in our case, it's not what we wanted to do. We wanted to get the output value of this get record node. So yeah, it's important to kind of like understand the double layering here and be careful with your bindings, and some of these dialogues because there's lots of the same words, like data variable name, then you have the data variable, then you have the data that you want to set the data variable to. So you need to kind of like be rigorous about these things, especially since here we're doing some custom logic to fit the GPS location. But yeah, that was the mistake.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I think that's a good place to end now that we've got a kind of full, we've seen the full journey then that this application took on. So thanks everyone so much for joining us. Yeah, lots of great comments and questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to everyone's questions, but like I said, feel free to go ahead and give us a shout out on Twitter. And also you can come and ask all the tech questions on the forums. That's usually the best place to kind of ask the more detailed questions. And usually the questions that you might have already been addressed earlier. So that's always good to kind of search around there for some answers.
Yeah, and do check the rest of our YouTube channel and documentation pages. I think we're closing in on having about 100 videos on different topics. So there's lots of content to go through.
Yeah, I think I don't know if you have a plan or to create like a full tutorial of this weather app, but it would be
eventually, yes,
see.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. There's going to be like an edited version of this too, but first
Yes.
you'll probably see the edited version of this broadcast.
The Hollywood versions.
Yes, with special effects.
Share. Great. And I realized that I actually didn't introduce myself at the beginning, but my name is Ishmay and I'm the content marketing manager at AppGyver. We just kind of jumped in there, but yeah, so I also run the blog. And if you have a app that you're creating, an interesting project, I feature the Creator of the Week series on our blog. And if anyone has any interesting projects or something that they would like to feature, go ahead and get in touch with us. And you can reach us on Twitter or the forums as well. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope you guys found this helpful.